my sister's brother-in-law has that. I'll have to ask her, like, never happened.
That's the only real reason I can see for self-driving vehicles.
Well, I can see a lot of things.
Right?
And if we can get the air on one in here, sure, it's warm in here. Do you want me to take a look at it? Or is it just me?
You're welcome to take your jacket off.
I probably will, so. Thank you.
Understand.
Yeah. 67.
Really?
Is that what it's set at, or what it's?
That's what it is.
Wow.
I don't believe it.
I don't either. It feels really warm. Cool, actually. Okay.
It's cooler than the 74
It's all right.
was.
All right, we'll go ahead and call the meeting to order. Stand for pledge. Pledge allegiance
To the flag of the United States of America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Roll call, please.
Davis,
Here.
Worth, here. Zelinski, here. I don't know, I say Therese. Miller, here, and Brown.
Yo. Here.
That's it, no.
Go ahead and open up public comment. Have anyone start?
Just speak loud so that the recordings pick you guys up, please.
All right. And then I'll close public comment, a little bit 5:01. And then hand it over to Ralph for his presentation.
All right, thank you. Well, thank you for taking your time. I know that everyone's very busy doing lots of different stuff, so taking an opportunity for some learning is very valuable. My background is I spent 27 years in local government. So I worked for cities, I worked for counties. I was my last local government, I spent 11 years as a township manager. So I have a lot of experience at that local level. Previously, to come to Manor-Casterison, I actually worked for the state of Michigan. So I worked for the Bureau of Local Government Services in the state of Michigan. So as part of that role there, we monitored local governments at the local level to find and identify communities that might be struggling. And then we would work with them to try to find ways to make improvements to them. We were also responsible for submission of your audit, you get your borrowing, all of the statutory components of local government was done through our office, as well as we did education and training. One of the things we thought was really important is to raise the educational fluency of all of our local government officials. About a year and a half ago, I came to Manor-Casterison. We're primarily an accounting CPA firm, but we have a large local government presence, and I was brought on board to expand their government consulting services. So as a firm, when we work with local governments, we have an area that kind of our bread and butter, which is the audit side of the business. We also have an area that works with local governments on what we call outsourced accounting. So that's the debits and credits of anything that has to do with local government. And then consulting services is kind of everything else. So anything that I would have done as a city manager is what I tried to help our local governments with. So today's presentation is really focused on how to manage your own fiscal health as a local government. So as part of that, we're going to start off talking about good governance and what that means, what kind of role the role of government is. A finance primer, so there's lots of accounting words and stuff, and so we want to make sure that we all have the same basic knowledge as we get into more depth. Fiscal indicators is a way to measure your current situation, so we're going to talk a little bit about those and talk specifically about your guys' indicators. And then we're going to get into budgets and CIP. I'll define CIP more later, and then we'll talk about your guys' audit. So we actually have your guys' information that we'll review. But before we get into the finances of local government, I wanted to kind of set the stage in terms of what the purpose of local government is. And ultimately, the purpose of local government is to deliver services to the public that the private sector can't provide. But to be able to do that, you have to have kind of three tenets, and you have to be able to do those well. One is just overall good governance. That's having a well-run organization, having good public discourse, both internally with the board as well as the public, have active and dedicated public and appointed servants, having strategic direction, actually having some place you're trying to get to, something you're trying to improve on, and then continuous learning, doing exactly what you're doing now, which is Government's very complex, and we can always do a little bit better, no matter how well we're doing, and we can find ways to do a little bit better. Government also has to have strong policies and procedures and systems in place. Without those, you put yourself at risk, so this is a way to manage risk. It ensures that you stay in compliance with both your local policies and procedures you may have, but also state statutes as well. And then ultimately, which we're going to talk a lot about today, is efficient use of your resources, both from a short-term as well as a long-term perspective. So ultimately, the money that you guys are managing is not yours, it's the public's. And so you have a responsibility to kind of spend that wisely. Now, when I say spend it wisely, it doesn't mean not spend money, right? We get these resources, and we want to spend that money, but we want to make sure that's adding short-term and long-term value for your community. The other thing about efficient use of resources is really, we tend to think about the budget for tomorrow, but really anything that you do today is going to have an impact for the next 5, 10, 15, 50 years from now. So we want to make sure that we understand that, and we understand that, that we're having that long-term impact. So ultimately, if you kind of think about these three outside goals, these three different tenets, it allows you to make sure that you're effectively and efficiently using those limited resources to have a positive impact on your community, your residents, and your businesses. Now, as we look at local governments, we all want to be vibrant. You know, hopefully that's what our goal is, to have vibrant communities that we want people to move to, stay in, and continue to thrive, right? But to be able to do that, you have to have pillars. And these are, and for every community, they might be a little bit different. So this is just some generic ones. But these pillars are the foundation that every community has to do, and they have to do well to be able to achieve that ultimate goal of vibrancy. Public safety. You know, we all want to feel like we're safe, and we want to make sure we have access to the services when we need those. When we need those. Economic development. That's about growth. Communities have to grow, have to prosper. So we have to have some way to make sure that we have strong growth. We have to have quality of life. You know, that's different for different people. That can be maybe having nice places to eat. That could be having parks to recreate in. Arts. I mean, obviously, I know Interlocken's not here, but it's obviously something very strong in this region. That's an example of that. Infrastructure. Many of our communities, and I know you guys don't provide water and sewer, but many of our communities are providing basic infrastructure. But one thing that all of our communities have to worry about is roads. And then the other one we have in there is schools. Even though you have nothing to do with schools, schools become a critical component, right? Because if you don't have any one of these things, then you're less likely to be able to be vibrant. But to be able to do that, we have to start with a foundation. And that foundation is strong financial management, public engagement. You have to have engaged public. You have people from the public here, which is wonderful. I go to some communities, they won't ever have any public engagement. It's difficult to gauge how you're doing if you don't have that public that's engagedness. And then this concept, again, good governance, focused, elected, and appointed officials. So all of these become a critical role in terms of when you think about managing your resources, you have to think about these pillars and what we're doing those resources to ultimately achieve success. Now the bad thing about local government is there's lots of things that are pulling against it. There's lots of challenges that you have. First of all, it's amazingly more complex than anybody ever said. I talk to elected officials almost every week, and they get into local government because it's like, this can't be rocket science, right? I mean, this is not that big a deal. And they get into it, and they start realizing the complexity of what you do. You know, for most businesses, you do one thing. You make a widget, and you learn how to do that, and you do that well. Well, local government, you have to manage roads, you have to manage elections, which are phenomenally complex. And compared to almost 30 years ago when I started, elections were way easier than they are today. They get more and more complex every single year. So you do planning, you do all these different things. Now all of a sudden you have to become an expert on all those different things. We continue to get more regulation. I mentioned elections is a perfect example of that. Over the last couple of years, the increased regulations that you have, but financial regulations, accounting regulations, all of those things. So for example, in accounting, we have GASB, the Government Accounting Standards Board, and there's going to be 101 GASB standards, and these are all just for local governments, and that's a tremendous amount of regulation that governs our local governments. So I won't go through all of these, but one of them that's relatively new and newer, again, compared to when I started out, is public discourse. Public discourse has completely changed. The way we communicate and talk with each other is different. Social media and the impacts of social media become a significant challenge that local governments have to figure out ways to manage. So as we talk about finances, we talk about these types of things, it's easy to talk about numbers, but we have to realize we have a lot of things that are pulling against us. And so the better job we can do at managing our finances, the less that these things maybe will negatively impact us, and we can focus on those in a different fashion. So one of the things with good government is you need to know not only, let's say different. So much of what we do as local government officials is allocate resources. And to be able to allocate resources, you have to know two things. You gotta know where you're at, and you gotta know where you're going. And if you don't know that, then you're gonna be blind. If you're blind, you're gonna make short-term decisions that are gonna have long-term consequences. So I'll give you an example. So the community that I was a township manager in, there's a community just north of us, and they really wanted to have a lot more development. And so they went on their own and they financed the expansion of water and sewer system. And they looked at it and says, well, if we build out these homes, then when people come in, there'll be enough revenue to pay off this development that we have, that the township put their own money out onto, and we'll expand our population, which is one of their goals, objectives. Well, they did that about, I guess, maybe 2005. What happened in 2007? We had a major economic crisis. Now, I don't like to say this, but I started as a township manager in 2007, and then the economy crashed, and I don't think it was my fault, but I still haven't proven that to be the case. I'm the guy, exactly. But in this case, in this community, all of a sudden, they were stuck with paying bond payments for this water and sewer system that they thought they were making a great decision to expand their community, and it drove them almost into bankruptcy. They had to have the county and the neighboring city basically bail them out to do that. So that's an example of, it's a short-term decision, and with the data that they had, they thought they made the right decision, but obviously it turned out to be a very strong negative for them. So that's what we have to be thinking about, is that these short-term decisions and how they might impact us. So again, one of the things I always want to focus on is that these decisions that we have today have an impact for the next 30, 40, 50 years. Example, a lot of communities got ARPA money. Well, how those communities spent ARPA money may dramatically change the course of that local jurisdiction. Did they spend the money that makes a transformational change for their community? Or did they spend their money on a project that they wanted to do, but is now something you have to support the rest of their lives? The example I always like to use is a splash pad. Lots of communities want splash pads. It's really a hip thing to do. It's great. But if you spend your ARPA money on a splash pad, well, now you've got to maintain that. And there's a cost every single year to maintain that, right? You have chemicals, you have employees that may have to do things, and it's a depreciating asset. Eventually, you're going to have to put more money into that, right? And so if you didn't think about that when you spent that money, now all of a sudden you have an expenditure that you have to make sure you build into your budget. And if you didn't put those together in terms of your planning, you put yourself in potentially a precarious situation. So, let me see if there's any other things. So, one of the things that we like to do is make sure that as you take the deep dive, we want to make sure that we all ultimately have a great understanding of our county. Okay, so now primary. So when we look at local government, GASB, that standards board that I talked about before, establishes that local governments put their money into different types of funds. And these funds are different buckets in terms of how you guys manage your resources. And in local government, we have government funds, and these, the primary fund within the government fund is the general fund. And this is where your primary expenditures for managing your organization going to. And we'll talk a little bit more about each of these as we get in more depth. You also have special revenue funds. Special revenue funds are funds that have restricted revenue sources. So for example, you guys have the fire millage and the road millage. That money has to be put in a special revenue fund because you have to make sure that you only spend the money on the items which that money was intended for. Now, you guys don't have a lot of the other ones. A lot of communities, if you, for example, have a water sewer fund, you have an enterprise fund because that's a business type fund and it has to be self-supporting. So in your guys' case, really the only thing you have is a general fund, a special revenue fund, and a capital projects fund. I think it's I can't remember if it's a 403 or internal service fund, but we'll talk a little bit more as we get into more depth. So, but the proprietary funds are, again, business type funds. Fiduciary funds is money that other people's money. It's not your money, so you're just holding it in trust. And then component units, if you have, there are entities that are separate. So in a county, for example, the road commission is a component unit. So they're legally separate, but the county has some type of ownership or impact over that organization. So in most cases, the road commission, the commissioners are appointed by the board, etc. Now, I mentioned you guys, this is your guys' funds, and we'll talk a lot more about this when we get into the budgets. But when we look at funds, and we'll talk about this in the next slide as well, all the funds are here are general fund type funds. So we have general fund, but underneath there you have 3 cemetery funds, which are basically sub-general fund funds. And then we have our special revenues, which are all the 200s down here. And then we have the equipment replacement fund, which again we'll talk more when we get into the budget. But that gives you a perspective of your funds. Now, you'll notice on that last screen, when we had the funds, they all started with a series of numbers. And those numbers tell us something. So the Michigan Department of Treasury issues what's called the Uniform Chart of Accounts. So when I was at Treasury, it's one of the things that we produced. And that's required under Public Act 2 of 1968, which is the Uniform Budget and Audit Act. And in that, we have basically a series of things. The first thing is we have our digits. So every community has a general fund, and every general fund starts with 101, no matter where you're at in the state of Michigan. I knew that all of those accounts that I said are special revenue are special revenues because it started with 200s. So it tells you something. The next set of digits we have is our activity. So the clerk's office in every community is going to have the same set of numbers, et cetera. And then we have our last 3 that are our account numbers. So that's going to be your wages. So most communities' wages are 702. The nice thing about this is that because you get all those list accounts, if you wanted to do analysis and take everything that's a 702 account and have the computer basically total the total amount that you spend on wages, you can do that because when you record things, it records it in the same bucket. So that's kind of the purpose for the state chart of accounts and what we do with that. Other key terms, fund balance. One of the things that we'll find out as we talk about this is one of the most critical things that you have to know what it means and what your fund balance is and what you're trying to do with your fund balance. But in essence, your fund balance is your savings account. So in any year, in year 1 that local government started, you had $100 in revenue and you had $90 in expenses, you'd have $10 left over. Well, that becomes your fund balance. So next year, you start with $10. And if again, we have the same revenues and expenditures, next year, now your fund balance is going to be $20. So now in the 3rd year, if your revenues were less than your expenditures, well, now you're going to take money from your fund balance. So your fund balance is kind of your savings account. Now, one of the things that many of our communities get confused about is deficits. A lot of communities say, well, we can't have a budget that's in a deficit. Well, we have to make sure we understand when we say deficit, what are we talking about? So there's 3 different types of deficits. The first is deficit spending or surplus spending. So when we talked about adding or taking away from the fund balance, that's what we're doing. So in my scenario, the first 2 years, we had surplus spending, right? We brought in more money than what we were spending. And then the 3rd year, we had deficit spending. It's perfectly fine. You can do that. That's how our government is supposed to work and operate. Then you have structural budget deficit. So a structural budget deficit is when you add up all of your reoccurring items. So you have utility bills, you have salaries, we have all these items that are the same from year to year, and we exclude anything special. So in the fire department, you know, we have the operations, but if they buy a fire truck one year, it may look like that fund is in a traumatic decline, but fire trucks are very expensive, right? So when we talk about structural budget deficit, we're just talking about the normal ongoing operating. And you want to make sure that your normal ongoing operating is not in a deficit situation. Because if it is, I went down about a month ago, and this is the second year in a row I did a budget presentation for a local community, and they have a structural budget deficit. What it means is that they have plenty of fund balance, but every single year they're eating away just a little bit of their fund balance, a little bit of the fund balance, and eventually they're going to run out of money, right? So you have to make sure that you understand that in terms of your position. Now, the last one is an actual deficit. This is the thing that you can't have. This is when your revenues not only exceed your expenditures, or your expenditures exceed your revenues, but more importantly, you've used up all of your fund balance. You have no more left. And so that's when people think about deficits, this is the one that you can't do. The other ones you can do as long as you know you're doing them and you're planning for them. Appropriations. When you adopt your budget, you adopt it via an appropriations resolution. This is basically just a term saying these are going to be my expenditures next year. Encumbrances, I don't know if you guys use the purchase order system and do encumbrances or not. Most local governments, the smaller ones don't. But encumbrances are basically a way of saying, well, I know I have a contract that I'm not going to spend the money on until 9 months from now. I want to make sure when I look at my budget, I see that even though it's not an expenditure yet, because it doesn't become an expenditure until you pay the bill. So encumbrance is a way basically to set aside money so that you see it in your budget reports. And then basis of accounting, one of the things when we looked at that previous slide that had the general fund, the governmental funds, and the proprietary funds, et cetera, is all of those have a different basis of accounting. You don't really have to know what this means. It just means that the way we record and recognize revenue can be different on different funds. So this is one of those things that make government complex. Because if you're looking at one fund, you may record things one way, and then another fund, you may record things slightly different. And sometimes that becomes really important, especially at the end of your fiscal year when you're managing budget. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. All right, financial condition. So your financial condition is a local government's ability to balance your recurring expenses with recurring revenues and providing services on a continuous basis, right? So what we don't want to have is be in a situation where all of a sudden one year, well, we have to dramatically cut our services because state revenue sharing gets cut. We didn't plan for that, we didn't expect that. Or that community that had a structural deficit, you know, eventually they're going to have to cut something, right? Because you have to change. When you have a situation where you can't provide continuous services, there's only two things you can do. You can increase revenue, or you can cut expenses, or you do both, right? So that's one of the things we want to make sure that we're not putting ourselves in a situation before it becomes an issue. So one of the things that we'll talk about when we get our indicators is that there's liquidity and solvency. So solvency is your ability to meet your long-term obligations. Being liquid is your short-term obligations. So can you pay your bills in the next 60, 90, 120 days? 6 months is more of a liquid situation. That's really about cash. Do you have enough cash on hand? And solvency is looking long-term. So if you have bonding, you have debt, you have to make sure that you can pay for that over the long term. And this will make a little more sense when we talk about our indicators when we come up. So one of the things that when our financial conditions, if a local government struggles balancing their budget, they're going to suffer through service delivery issues. And these things can happen because of both financial changes, but also social economic changes as well. And so when we think about, when I talk that slide about where you're at and where you're going, one of the of the things that's not only important to do is to understand where we're at right now, but understand what's happening in your community as well. So we'll talk about that on a slide when we come up. So what leads to fiscal distress in communities? Not knowing where you're going, not having a plan that you're all in agreement on, that you're trying to achieve and accomplish. No long-term forecasting. That's if you don't know what is going to happen. For example, if you had to replace this building, this is extremely expensive to build now, right? This would probably completely wipe out your fund balance plus some. But if you don't know that this building needs to be replaced, you're not forecasting the future, then you're not planning for it, then you're probably making decisions about other expenditures that probably aren't the wisest decision. So making sure that you understand where you are and where you're going. One of the things that our local governments really struggle with now today is this knowledge, skills, and abilities to successfully run a local government. As I mentioned at the beginning, it's getting so amazingly complex. And I've been doing this, like I said, almost 30 years now, and every single week I learn something new. And I always feel like I'm, at best at 60% or 80% of where you need to be, just because it's so difficult. So, finding those individuals with strong KSAs, knowledge, skills, and abilities is difficult. And instability. A lot of the communities that we work in, it really comes down to their finances are fine, but they can't get along, right? And so that becomes a challenge for those local governments. We talked about structural deficits, deferred maintenance, not spending money. I have communities I work with that have a tremendous amount of money in their fund balance, but they come from a philosophy of, well, spending is bad. Well, that's good, but at some point, you have to make sure you're maintaining the assets that you guys have or that you've invested in. So you want to make sure that you're spending that money wisely. And then the inverse of that is not having enough reserves. Back again in 2007, when the housing crisis crashed, communities that didn't have enough reserves, what did they have to do? They had to make dramatic decisions. They had to cut services, they had to cut employees. It was a very stressful time. Communities that had appropriate level of reserves was able to maintain themselves without making dramatic changes, at least to be able to make adjustments. And that's an example. I lived worked in a suburban community that was growing very quickly. So it was very challenging for us, but we were able to manage our way out of it. So we actually went through the financial crisis, and we were actually able to add to our fund balances over the 5 years during that financial crisis. And that's because when we talk about long-term forecasting, we kind of thought about things that were going to happen, and we put ourselves in a position that we had enough reserves to start with, but then as soon as the financial crisis happened, we became very aggressive. So we, for example, were very aggressive on changing healthcare benefits and negotiating with our unions on healthcare benefits. We worked really hard to partner with our neighboring communities for regional collaborations to reduce costs. So we went through a whole series of things. Pension was a big one for us. We made changes to our pension system. And all those types of things allowed us, instead of being in a situation where we were cutting services, cutting employees, we were actually able to maintain and grow our fund balance and come stronger out of that negative situation.
Quick question before you go back a slide.
Okay.
Am I correct in thinking CIP is capital improvement program?
I'm sorry, I was going to define that later on. Yeah, but yes. So capital improvements program. So that's basically knowing what assets you have, knowing how long those assets are going to last, and knowing when you need to replace those assets, and having a plan to be able to replace those assets. So thank you. And again, I should have said at the beginning, I do a couple things. One is I'll just kind of talk. So if you guys want to use breaks, raise your hand and take a break. I tend to talk a little fast sometimes, so if I'm talking too fast, just let me know. And again, if I use a word that you don't understand, please define it. The purpose of this is to learn, and I'm skipping over something that the old professors always say, right? There's no dumb question. There's not. The part of this is learning. So yes.
How do you define enough reserve?
That's almost a setup for me. So I have a whole series of slides on that. That's perfect. So thank you. And the other thing too is that if at any point we want to stop and have a conversation about one of these, let's have a conversation. This doesn't have to be just one-on-one. This can be, if there's something that is facing your community that we want to talk through about those, this is a great opportunity to do that. So indicators are a way to gauge where you guys are at and where you might be going. And the ICMA, the International City Managers Association, basically says there are kind of 3 different ways that you can manage, or look at indicators to manage where you're going. Now, we're going to focus obviously on our financial condition on the next couple slides, and those are the obvious ones, those are the easiest ones. But we also have to keep in mind is that when we want to measure your organization and health of your organization, there are other things as well, environmental factors. Are you an aging community? Right? If you are, like the community I worked in, the last one was a suburban community, that was having a large influx of families moving in. That's a different problem than if I work in a community that's aging in place, right? And those put different demands on your resources and your needs within your communities. External factors, for example, our economic condition of the federal government always has a dramatic impact on us. When I talked about 2007, the reason 2007 was so difficult for local governments is not only did your taxable value fall, but at the same time, the state of Michigan couldn't manage their own budget, so they took away most of revenue sharing for local governments. So they managed their budget deficits on the backs of our local units of government. So you guys get a double whammy, and you'll see later on why that becomes important. So that's an example of external forces that way on us. And then we have organizational factors as well. Already mentioned about boards and how well boards work together, but that's an example of organizational factors that can negatively impact us. Okay, so in the fiscal ones, there are really 3 that I'm going to talk about. There's a 4th one, but I didn't bring it for you guys. So the first one, and I think this is the most important one, and it's the reason it's most important is because it's the easiest to measure among yourself with other communities. It's the easiest to understand, and it really has the largest impact on the long term. It's not perfect, but it's good. And that is our fund balance ratio. So when I talked about our fund balance before, our reserves, well, if we take that, how much we have, and we divide it by our revenues, so if we had a fund balance that had $100 in it, and I had revenues of $100, divide those out, it's going to be 100%, meaning that I have enough money in the bank to handle 100% of what my revenues are. So in my next year, if I got 0 revenues, I would, in theory, have enough money in the bank to pay for everything, right? And this is going to get to your question in about 4 or 5 more slides, because this is the key to that. Now, when we look at you guys, you guys are at 149%. Now, that's based upon 2022, and on 2023, you're actually up to 167%. Well, how does that make you compare? Well, the median, not the average, but the median, because we want the middle, because the average gets skewed by communities that have way too little or way too much fund balance. But the median is 150%. So in 2022, you were at the 49th percentile, and 167%, you're probably at the 153rd percentile. And I still get to your question in even more depth in a minute. The other 2 indicators are your taxable value per capita. So your taxable value per capita is a way to gauge whether the local government has the capacity to effectively generate enough revenue to be able to pay for your services. So what does that mean? Well, every community, when you look at one of your primary revenue sources is your taxation, and your taxation is made up of 2 components. One is your millage rate, which you can control directly, and the other one is your taxable value, and that's mathematical formula. So if I have a community that has a very low taxable value per capita, so anything less than about 18,000, it doesn't really matter what my millage rate is. I'm going to have a hard time, because my taxable value is so low, even with an extremely high millage rate, generating enough money to pay for services. If you're a community like that, you have a way harder job than if you have a community. I'm working with another community north of here that their taxable value per capita is on the high side. They're at something like, their median is like 85% of other communities. Well, they're having troubles with revenues as well, but their situation is completely different than it is in other communities. And so this is not something you can directly control, right? Because it's hard to have an impact on your taxable value. A to understanding the ability for you to generate revenue to pay for services. And if you have a lower taxable value per capita, you're gonna have to be even more cautious than if you have a higher taxable value per capita. Yes, sir.
These numbers are actually inland township numbers
Yes.
from 22.
From 22, yep. So the township number is your guys' number, and then the median. So you guys, it's interesting. I double checked this number today because I didn't think this number was right because, I mean, you're pretty close to $39,000 a year, and you're only at 32%. And I thought, well, that's got to be error. You got to be closer to 50%, 45% or something. But I think it's a standard deviation. We just have a lot of communities that are right in that middle pocket. So it doesn't take you very far to be off to be on the bottom side of that. But overall, again, you're pretty close to the median. Net position is your long-term outlook. So your net position takes into account any debt that you have. For a lot of our urban communities, pension and OPEB play into that. And so one of these things is that you guys are very high on this one, which means that you have, compared to your revenues, you have very, very low debt. And one reason is there's such a difference here, again, is because while this is just measuring township, there's over 1,200 townships in the state of Michigan, and they vary dramatically, right? I have urban townships, the township that I was, a very urban township. I mentioned before, we didn't have OPEB, which is retiree health care, but we had pension. Our situation looks completely different when you have pension on the books. So we have a lot of those urban communities. So that's why you guys are so much stronger in this position than other communities. And also, when you look at this, you can think about opportunities too. As you think about long term, it's like, okay, if we're really low on this indicator, that means that we probably have capacity that if we do need to borrow, we can borrow, and we're probably still going to be in a pretty good position because debt's not bad at the local level at all. So, okay, so let's talk about some of your guys' specific indicators that you guys have. Hello, welcome. So, taxable value. I mentioned your taxes are made of two components. One is your guys' millage rate, but the other one is the taxable value. So in Michigan, taxable value is limited by two components. One is Headley, which impacts your millage rate, and the other is Proposal A, which impacts your taxable value. And so between 2010 and 2016, your guys' taxes increased by 6.3%, or about 1% a year. That's all your value in your increase. And if you think about any business, 1% a year in growth is very, very difficult to manage. Right? That is just barely getting by. Now, one reason why we saw really low growth this year is one, is you have to think back to 2007, which is not on here, you would have been down even lower because we had the housing crisis, so your values dropped and they started coming back up. But during this period of time, we had extremely low inflation. And the way that Proposal A works, it says you can't increase your taxable value by either 5% or the rate of inflation, whatever is less. So we had a year in here that we had a negative, we had a year that was 1.2%, we had some really low years. And so what that did to local governments is that prevented you from increasing your value that increases your ability to bring in more revenues. The only way that you can increase revenues is really, because if we all have homes in the township and we live there every year, we don't make any changes, then my value is only going to go up with my Proposal A, right? So it's whatever that 1.2% or whatever that inflationary increase is, that's the limitation to it. The only way that we see an increase there is two things. One is new homes, right? So if you're building lots of new homes, then you have more value being added to the tax roll because 100% of that value gets added to the tax roll in that year. Or two, if we have uncapping. So if Jim sells his home and buys another home down the street, well, all of a sudden, if he owned that home for 50 years, because his taxable value is limited all the time, the new person is going to uncap and it's going to have a dramatic increase in it. Now, that ultimately has an impact on Headley, which impacts your millage rate, but that's really the best way that we can see increases. Now, between 2016 and 2023, you guys had a 75% increase or about a 10% a year increase. So that's a pretty substantial change. And this goes back to trends. When we're thinking about management, if you were in 2007 and looking at this graph, it being going down, you'd be sweating a lot more than now. You have a nice steady increase. Now, will that increase stay, continue? I'm always a pessimist. I'm going to say absolutely not. It's going to continue to flatten back out. There's all kinds of factors that might impact our economy, which will impact home sales, et cetera, but you never know, right? So I think it's always better to be more conservative. Now, this looks at when we talked before about adding to our fund balance in a particular year, this is either your surplus or your deficit spending that you had in any 1 year over a period of time. Now, all this data too, didn't mention, is on the My Community Financial Dashboard. And one thing when we talk later about your budgets, this is great information. Go online, print this out, include it in your budget as background information to make people kind of understand what your trends are as you make decisions. But so between 2010 and 2022, 12 years, you had 7 years that had, or 58% of the time, you had deficit spending. You might look at that and say, well, that's a bad thing, right? This graph is neither good or bad. Like all data, you have to understand the data, and these are point-in-time measurements. And so, for example, one of the things that, and we'll see on the next graph after this why this matters, well, we can look at this and say, this might tell us a story, whatever you want to tell, but we have to realize a couple things. One is that you guys do an audit every other year. You're allowed to do that under state law. And so, on your off years, now I don't know which are, like, so this is an audit year. I think this is an audit year. This is an audit year. I think it's pretty much, it doesn't have to be every other year exactly. But the point being is that the other years is unaudited data. So you still submit data to say what your revenues and expenditures are. You got to do that every year, but it's not audited data. So it may not be as strong of information. So it may not tell us the story we think that it tells because it's not audited information. So we can see that when we look at, again, this is going to be the same situation because in the off years, it's going to be audited. But when we look at our unrestricted fund balance, which I'll define that later on, you can see other than, I'm not sure what happened in 2010 and 13, that could have been just a data error. Maybe you guys didn't do your F-65 that you're supposed to. I don't know what happened. So if you take those out, you're pretty flat, right? So that tells a lot different story than the last graph did. And this again just shows that sometimes we have to continue to dig deeper. So overall, your fund balance is not trending. It's not trending up. It's not trending down. But again, I have your decision. We have to look at it not a vacuum. So one of the things. Yes.
It would be important to know who the outliers are, why we're so low. Would that be important?
It would be in this case because it's 0. It's got to be a data error at some point. I don't know. I mean, because it's very unlikely to go from 200% down to 0. That, I mean, it certainly happens. Trust me. But in your guys' case, I think that's probably just maybe something didn't get filled out in that particular thing. The other thing, though, when you look at this and it says, "Oh, this is flat or stable," but what does it not tell us? Well, it doesn't tell us that I have a tremendous amount of deferred maintenance. I used the example of the Township Hall before. Your Township Hall is crumbling around you. You have to have a Township Hall. Well, all of a sudden, we're going to have to buy a new Township Hall, but that fund balance is going to disappear, right? So data is only good as all the other data that surrounds it and understanding this. If I know, if I have a good capital improvements plan and I know that's going to be for a long period of time, stable might be perfectly fine. But you might be in a community that says, well, I'm gonna partially fund a new Township Hall with cash. Our goal is to see this increase. We want to get this to 250%. Or, and we'll talk about later, maybe you want to get that fund balance reduced. I'll talk about why you want to do that. So I mentioned this before, but these are other indicators. We're not going to talk about them, but they're good to know. So not just looking at the data we have, but medium housing values. This is a different community, but here's an example of what happened. This is after 2007 with values that are dropping and understanding what is happening in your communities. If you're in a community that is having, like the community that I mentioned just north of us, their new home prices, the average is like $800,000, $900,000. I mean, that is a completely different financial position that they're going to be in than a community. And we work with another community, Inkster, Michigan. You know, you look at that community and home values are probably $40,000, right? I mean, and knowing what those trends are in those communities. But, you know, unemployment rate, I mentioned population that's aging in place, you know, all those types of things, all talk about the level of services and the types of services you have to provide. You should know what those are, what those factors are for your community. So, I've talked about this a little bit already, but with all good data, it's limited. One of the problems with like the indicators like fund balance and some of those types of things, one is, we already mentioned, like timing-wise, you guys do audits every other year. So your data is already 6 months old in the year you do the audit. When you don't do an audit, it's 18-month-year-old data. It doesn't take into account political, social considerations with your communities that might be happening. It doesn't tell you if you're delivering the right level of service. I've got communities that have fund balances that are in the 90th percentile, but maybe they're not providing the right services to their community needs, going back to, we want to grow and be vibrant. We want to make a difference in our community. So having lots of money doesn't tell you you're doing a good job at doing services, right? So it only tells you a limited picture, so we just have to recognize that. Okay, so this gets to your question ultimately, which is, what is the correct level of fund balance? So when we look at fund balance, and we'll see this when we talk about the audit later on, fund balance is actually broken up into 5 different buckets. And these different buckets, and again, when we talk about the audit, we'll see these, go from the most restricted to the least restricted. So non-spendable is what's called prepaids. Frankly, this is what when I talk about GASB and the auditors, this is something that they have to do. For example, if you pay for insurance, that's going to be for the next year, you technically can't record that as an expenditure in the current fiscal year. You have to record it as expenditure in the next fiscal year, and so you have to show this as a prepaid. It's for the lay people like me, it means absolutely nothing. It's usually a very, very small amount, but we still have to understand that. If you see not expendable, that means an expenditure that you've already done this year, but you're actually going to get the benefit from the next year. Insurance is the number one thing. Restricted means that there are some outside restriction on the use of that money. So you don't get to willy-nilly say how I'm going to use that money. Whatever those restrictions are going to be. So your roads money is restricted. So when it goes in a fund balance, it shows up as restricted. You don't have, you have control over spending it, but you can only spend it on roads, or whatever that original millage says. Committed and assigned are very, very similar. So committed is something that the board can do to basically say that, my Township Hall example, I want to commit some of my fund balance to setting aside to building a new Township Hall in the future. You just do that with an official action of the board, and then that money gets set aside, and then it's committed for that. Now, this board or a future board can uncommit that with the same action, right? So if you did a motion, a resolution, you can commit funds to it, and then you can uncommit funds. But it's more formal, right? Assign is when you delegate it basically to, in my case as a township manager, I could assign money. So I could assign money for the Township Hall as an example if I wanted to, or other potential projects that we're having coming up. But in your guys' case, it would probably be, usually like the clerk or supervisor agreeing that we're going to assign some money. And then unassigned is everything else. So most of your money stays in unassigned because we don't have these other restrictions that we have on it. So the question always becomes, what is the amount, the perfect amount of fund balance that we have? Well, just like Goldilocks, too much is bad, too little is bad. Right? Too little, if we don't have enough reserves, then if we have unexpected, unplanned events, significant economic downturn, some significant expense that we did not anticipate or planning, then we won't have enough money to, again, maintain a level services for our community. So too little bad. Why is too much bad?
Taking money from people you don't need to.
Taking money from people you don't need to. Yep. So the whole purpose of government is that I tax people to pay, to provide specific services in that given year that you tax them for, and they receive those services. If you're taxing people and you're keeping their money and you have no plans to use it, you have no capital improvements plan, you don't know what that's for, you're just keeping it because you want to be very, very conservative mindset. Well, that means that if I'm living in this community and I live here for 10 years and you tax me for 10 years, and then the 11th year I leave, well, I never got benefit from those taxes that I paid. So having too much fund balance can be a bad thing too. Now it's up to you, and we'll talk about this. I guess I'll get ahead of myself. So what should you have? A lot of times what people say is 16.67% or 2 months of operating revenues. Forget this number. This is a number that's been predicated with conventional wisdom because when you look at GASB, the Government Accounting Standards Board, they say that the absolute minimum, you should never have anything less than 2 months expenditures. But the reality of what GASB says is that you should have a policy that defines what your fund balance should be. And for different communities, the factors impacting how much fund balance is dramatically different. So when we talk back at this previous slide, and when we talk about the median fund balance for cities, or for townships, we're about 150%. Well, if you guys were a city, the median would be probably about 30%. Right? So it's a different type of government, and there's a bunch of factors that go. Cities tend to be larger. They tend to have larger budgets. Well, 50% of $10 million versus 50% of $400,000 is dramatically different, right? That's 50% of $400,000 is not quite as much money, and stuff's very expensive. So the bigger you are, you can have a lower fund balance. How good a job you do in budgeting. If you are very close every single year on your revenues and expenditures, you don't have a lot of variability, you can probably get by with a lower fund balance. But if you have bad practices when it comes to budgeting, you're going to have a lot more money. Ultimately, what GASB says is that you have to have a policy. You need to figure out what your fund balance works for your community based on your conditions, your factors that impact you, and say, this is what I want my fund balance to be. Well, how you set that, it can be very difficult, but what I recommend communities do is to start with what we started on that first slide when we talk about fund balance, which is compare yourself to other communities. So not only look at the median as an example, but you can go to that My Community Financial Dashboard and you can click on other townships that you think are similar size, similar taxable value, similar services, kind of see what their fund balances are, and compare yourself to other communities, and then make an educated decision, like, okay, where do we want to be? Maybe we want to be a little more conservative because we know, for example, we haven't had a capital improvements plan. We know that we've had a lot of deferred maintenance, and we're going to have a lot of expenditures coming up in the future. Or you might look at it and say, well, I can be a little bit on the lower side there because we don't have a lot of assets. Our assets are maintained really well. We don't need to hold as much taxpayers' money because, again, too much could be bad too if you don't have a plan for it. So maybe we need a little bit less. So unfortunately, the answer to your question is it depends. Right? You can't answer that. But by setting a policy, first of all, you can change that, right? You can grow with that and figure out what works for you. But then what allows you during the budgeting process is it changes your decisions that you're making. Like if I need to grow my fund balance and I'm low, you're going to make completely different decisions during that process than if I have too much. Right? That's going to change your decision-making process. So that becomes one of the most critical drivers during the budget process of knowing where your fund balance is.
You said you've worked for the state in assisting communities in their decision-making, so to speak. There's a concern about how much money the township has and how the state might look at that with their revenue sharing. Did you ever run across the state saying, you know, you've got too much money, we're not going to give you any more?
Yeah. So so inside baseball, the state goal is to partner with communities. Right? So when the state works with communities, they want to encourage entities to move in the right direction. But at the end of the day, they have limited power. Right? There's only so many state laws that they can do. When it comes to revenue sharing is defined by state statute in the Constitution. So you really can't mess with that. So no matter how, now, there's some exceptions there. The community I mentioned before, like Inkster, they are in significant challenges right now. They have a cash flow problem because, and for multiple reasons, but one is the state's withholding the revenue sharing. But the reason the state's holding the revenue sharing is because they haven't got their audit in. And so they're allowed to, under state law, if you don't get your audit in, this is our carrot to encourage you to get it done. So that's an example. But, you know, again, I have communities that they just have, again, mindset of, we all have different opinions about how to run local government, but they can be very, very conservative. Spending money is bad, so they keep lots of money. The state's never going to come in and say, you've got too much money. Now, they come in and say, you know, look, you should be thinking about this. You know, do you have a plan? And the same side if you have too little. Now, in the state's perspective, frankly, our focus was on with the too littles, always, right? Because those are the ones that if they go into fiscal distress, then that's going to have an impact on not only the community they're in, but even neighboring communities, state of Michigan. So our goal was really to raise the bar, if you will, for our local governments to keep them on a positive track. So, yeah.
So when they say that they're gonna keep your money, it's really, they're just gonna keep it temporarily so you get, okay.
Yeah, so the audit example is a perfect example of that. It's thank you, and that's what I should have said. The goal of the state, the first and fundamental goal of the state is compliance, compliance, compliance. That's all they care about. They want to get you in compliance. Now, the reason I actually went to the Treasury was because at the time, Treasury was trying to change its mindset because previously, Treasury had always been reactive. So we think about our communities that went into fiscal distress. Instead of doing something before they went into fiscal distress, the state waited until they went into fiscal distress, and then they tried to help them and fix them. But that doesn't work most of the time, right? So proactive nature. So the reason I was brought in, the deputy treasurer and treasurer at the time were really trying to change that from just being compliance, and that was the only thing we were focusing on, but working in this perspective, okay, let's find and identify communities that are struggling, and then let's proactively help them so we can keep them out of distress. So that's really the goal. Getting compliance number one, but secondarily, it's just being proactive and making a difference around the state. Good questions. Okay. So set a policy, know where you're at, figure out what's right for you. Okay. So it's been an hour. I'm going to go to budgeting. Do you guys want to keep going? Keep going? All right. All right. So budgets. So your budgets is really about inputs versus outputs. You have the things that you're trying to accomplish as a community, your goals, your priorities, statutory requirements. You know, elections this year, you get to do early voting, right? Fun thing that we all had to do. That's a statutory change. You have to, that's an input, right? You didn't have a choice to find a way to do that, no matter what the financial impacts were you're in a community. And then on the output of that is service delivery. It goes all the way back to the beginning. That's what we have governments for, is to deliver critical public services to our community. So those are the inputs and the outputs. So the budget and the budget process is ultimately how you change and have impact on your finances, so anywhere from the fund balance we talked about, as well as the level of service you provide. So that's really what the budget process entails, is again changing whatever that financial condition is for the long term, as well as the services you're delivering. In my opinion, the budget, and I'm biased, I suppose, but is the single most important thing that you guys do. There's not a thing that you do that's more important than this. Because ultimately, again, this is about using other people's money, and it's about delivering services to your public and making a difference. And those decisions have those crucial, far-reaching, long-term consequences. So every decision, again, every little decision you make today, you know, for example, the first job I worked at was East Lansing. And I was 20-something years old, and we had this big meeting of all the department heads, and we were talking about next year's budget. And grant, and the grant was gonna pay for police officers. It was called the Cops More Grant. It was gonna pay for police officers for 5 years. And it's like, well, we've gotta take advantage of that. We need more police officers. It's gonna pay us for police officers 5 years. Well, but what's the catches to this? Well, we require that we will never downsize our staffing size. If we're at 50 officers and we get 5 officers in this, we're gonna be at 55, that becomes a new staffing level, we never reduce that. And so I'm new there, I'm young, and I'm like, well, but what happens if we need to go down back to 50? Well, you can't, and we don't want to because we need to be at 55, but what if we don't have the money to do that? Well, that's not a problem. We're doing great, everything's copacetic, right? And so they did the grant, because it's like we can't give up free money. Well, years later, East Lansing was struggling significantly financially. If you followed it at all, they tried to pass an income tax 2 or 3 times because they had a pension problem. They had so much unfunded liability they had, it was basically draining the city's finances down. And these decisions that they made, even though it was a short-term decision, it was free money, it had impacts on that community 30 years later. So that's the thing that we have to think about, every decision that you have and how that's going to impact the community. Splash pad is an example of that. You buy the splash pad, that's great, but now you have to maintain it. You have to maintain those assets. So always be thinking of those long term. Now ultimately, you guys have a fiduciary responsibility because you're spending other people's money, which means that you have to be prudent, you have to be transparent, you have to be ethical in all your financial decisions to ensure that your public resources are managed wisely in the best interest of the community. Not of what you think, but in best interest of the community ultimately. So you have a fiduciary responsibility, which again goes back to why I think budgeting is so important. So when we think about budgets, we tend to focus on the one thing that we talked about at the beginning, which is resource allocation. We have so much money coming in, we need to run elections, we have to assess properties, we have to collect taxes. These are the things that we legally have to do. And so we need to allocate those resources for the services. But in reality, your budget is much more than that. And I think that's, it really ultimately serves a much higher purpose. So one, it helps with improved decision making. So your budget, again, is not just about the numbers in your budget, but it's the decisions that you're going into and the budget process to figure out how you're going to allocate those resources between different competing priorities. There's always more things to do than there are resources available. So how do you make those decisions? Well, a good budget process will help define those priorities, set expectations, and ultimately make the better decisions. Your budget should be a transparency tool. It's an opportunity to tell your guys' story about how you're spending those resources. What are your priorities that you have in the community? What are the things that you're working on? What are some of the challenges that you're facing, and tell that story. It's a financial plan, so it's a plan not only for the short term, but the long term. And it ultimately helps you evaluate the different options you have. And then the budget helps with your fiscal responsibility, your accountability to yourselves, your accountability to your public, your overall management and monitoring of that budget on an ongoing basis. And your budget also becomes an implementation tool. You don't pass the budget and then like, oh, that's the most important thing we did it, now we don't have to worry about this for 9 months, right? Because ultimately when you pass the budget, now you have to implement the things that are on that budget to make sure that they're successful. And so your budget becomes the tool by which you implement the items that you've identified that you want to work on. So your budget also ultimately ties everything else that you guys do. So you guys have a planning commission, you have a master plan. That master plan has a vision for the future. Well, to be able to implement that vision, you have to be able to do that through your budget. If you apply for state grants, you might have Parks and Recs master plan. You might have a capital improvements plan. All the other things that you guys work to do, your budget ultimately is the thing that ties those visions, those conversations, those priorities together to allow you to implement that. But in the next few slides, I'm going to go through the budget process all the way around for community, just I guess some of the best practices. But before we talk about the process specifically, One of the things that I think is really, really important is the strategic plan. Because again, we had that slide way at the beginning that had the arrows on it about where you're at and where you're going. Well, your strategic plan is that guiding path of where we're trying to go to, what we're trying to accomplish, what we're trying to achieve. And it makes decision making so much better if before you get to the budget process, you know what those priorities are. You know what those, you've already had those conversations. Because again, there's always more priorities than there are resources, but how do you weigh two different? So if I'm a community that, I'm having a crime problem in the community, but I also, my financial software is not working and I can't get good numbers, how do you make a determination of which one you invest in if you can only invest in one? Well, your strategic plan can help do that. Your strategic plan also not only helps with developing your budget because it comes from one of your inputs, but it also helps with your implementation as well because it allows you to monitor yourself. And I'll talk a little bit more about that, I guess, in the next slide. So your strategic plan sets a clear vision, objectives that guide all your decision making going forward, and ensures that you're aligning yourselves with what your needs in your community are overall. So if you go back to that vibrant community model, this is what your strategic plan is doing, is identifying those different pillars and figuring out which one of those that you guys need to potentially strengthen to lead towards vibrancy. It helps with resource allocation, already talked about that. Strategic plan can be a great process for community engagement, to get feedback and input from the community. Helps with problem solving. Again, we can't do everything we want to do, but if we can think about that in a maybe not in a full board meeting, but it can be more stressful sometimes, but maybe a small workshop, we can help just have conversations. Ultimately, a strategic plan is kind of that foundation for overall good governance. So when I say budgeting is the most important thing to do, I say the second most important thing to do is strategic plan because it becomes the primary driver for what you put in your budget. So when you think about budgets, you can either have the minimums. So I mentioned PA2 before, the Uniform Budgeting and Accounting Act. And that's just the minimum requirements. These are the bare minimum things that all governments in the state of Michigan have to have. So it sets the, I mentioned earlier, you have an appropriations resolutions, and that's how you pass your budget. You have to pass your budget using an appropriations resolution. I looked at yours, your guys is perfect. I would probably say 50% of the communities that I work in don't do appropriations and resolutions, misses some of the key components, so you guys are doing a great job. But in that, it primarily adopts the budget, so that's the official action, you adopt the budget. But it also reconfirms and sets your millage rates for the year, and it defines your budget level of how you're adopting your budget, because that becomes important at the end of the year if you determine which accounts you have to make adjustments to. Also, the act requires you that in your budget that you have to show your expenditures and revenues, but not only for the upcoming year, i.e. the budget year, but you also have to have it for the previous year, so your previous year actuals, and then the current year you're in right now, what is supposed to be estimated at the end of the year. That's a critical one. Again, this is another one we see a lot of failures on local governments because they'll put in there, so they'll pass their budget 2 months before the end of the fiscal year, and they'll put in there what their current activity is, but what you're required to put is what do you think it's going to be at the last day of your fiscal year. So you have to have projections, so current year projections. You also have to have your beginning and ending fund balance. This is another one a lot of local governments don't include. We already talked about you can't have a deficit, and it also defines what funds you have to do the budget for. In other words, some of these ones we don't actually have to have budgets for. And it also defines that you have to file the uniform chart of accounts. So that's all the minimums that you have to have. But like anything, minimum is not the only thing we should do. Your budget should be an opportunity to have other values and purposes beyond those minimums. Ultimately, I think about a budget is that if you have one document that any citizen that moved in the community or any new board member that came on the board could pick up, and they could understand a lot of what I'm talking about today, understand government accounting, understand what happened to your budget last year, understand what some of your indicators are and your trends are. Now this becomes an education tool for everybody to have the same knowledge for the organization. And it goes back to government complex. Well, one way you can take a complexity out is by taking your budget and making it more than just a bunch of numbers is. Now, most of our governments, it's just numbers, but I think the point here is we're missing a significant opportunity. So, GFOA, the Government Finance Officer Association, has a program called the Distinguished Budget Award. And I'll talk about this in the next few slides. But basically, what they've done is says based upon this fact that your budget is way more than just allocating resources, it's all of these other things on here. You know, it's your transparency document. It helps you improve decisions, etc. What are some of the things that you should include in your budget to achieve some of those objectives? So the next couple slides are going to talk about some of these things that you can include in your budget. Now, one of the things that it can become overwhelming is that if you look at a budget that's received this award, it's probably at the minimum 60 to 120 pages. Your guys' budget now is 15 pages? Yes, 17. Okay. Am I telling you that you're completely missing the boat and you need next year to make a 100-page document? Absolutely not. Every community's needs are different. But a lot of things on this list are things that, well, if this year I can do one thing and add it to our budget, along with just the numbers, but add another section to our budget, then I've achieved a little bit of forward progress. And then the year after that, I add one more element to my budget, it becomes a little bit stronger. And by 10 years from now, you may not have everything on this list, but you have a much stronger document that achieves those bigger objectives. So what are some things you should include? Well, if you have a strategic plan, you put your strategic plan in the budget, because it's a driver, right? We can understand why my expenditures are what they are. This is the one that I think everybody should do. It's the one that I think you should do this year, is a budget message. A budget message usually comes from the supervisor or the manager. It explains what happened last year, right? You had a budget last year, not just talking about what we did this year, but talking about the successes we had last year, the challenges we had last year, the things that came up that we didn't expect that did. Talks about budget highlights. When we get to the budget, if you know, I don't know your community, when I look at the budget and I see that you know, your governing body went from $44,000 in 2023 to $91,000 in 2024-25, why? I don't know. Now I can dig in on this capital, but it doesn't tell me anything, right? They're just a bunch of numbers. So this is an opportunity to explain that, so that instead of having to fly spec and read every type of thing, I can read the budget message and understand the significant changes from one year to the next. I can understand what priorities, what projects we're going to work on in the upcoming year. Some of those long impacts. So if you have a new development that's coming in, or you have a new challenge that might be coming in, you just outline it in that budget message, so anybody that can pick that up can get more information. The next ones are a little bit more difficult, but read the guide to the budget. This is basically some of what we're doing now, which is just explaining to the layperson stuff that they may not understand. Understand the difference between a general fund and a special revenue fund. If you've never done government before and you picked this, you don't know, and you just know it is what it is. But now you can become more educated, and one of the things we'll talk about in your budget, you might, now that the more that you know, you may have questioned some of the stuff that you guys have done in your budget. So that's just an example of giving you more information that you have to have. Community overview, this is good because, you know, if you eventually do go out for bonding, if there's other types of purposes, if I'm new in the community, I can understand the community providing some of that information. Summary information, not as important for you guys because of, well, I guess the fire department, you have approved positions there probably, but the bigger organizations, the number of approved FTEs, et cetera, summaries, detailed budget information. So in your budget, we have all these different funds, but we don't have any description of what these funds are and what they're for. We have departments, but we don't describe what do they do and what are they for. So this gives you an opportunity to add some of that information from a textual perspective in that. What are our goals and objectives that we're trying to achieve? And then charts and graphs. They're a lot easier. At the beginning, I gave charts of your taxable value. If I were to just explain that to you words versus the graph, it's a lot easier to understand the graph. So the nice thing about this is, the nicest thing about government is, especially compared to the private sector, is if you want to do any of these types of things, how do you do it? You've never done it before. These are some good ideas. I want to do it. The next thing is you can go to the GFOA You can look up what other communities received this award in the state of Michigan. You can go to the website and you can steal their great ideas that they have. Oh, I love this format. Oh, I love how they explain this. And a lot of the stuff, you don't have to recreate the wheel. You just borrow it from your neighboring communities. So that's the nice thing about local government. All right. So the process. So this is getting into, I said we're going to talk a little bit about some of the steps. So the first step is you're beginning the preparation. This should occur 4 months, 6 months before. When I was a township manager at Charter Township, I started 9 months before, but it was an extremely complex budget. Start early, it's a lot easier to be prepared at the end and have a good budget the earlier you start. Develop a budget calendar. So this sets expectations for everybody of when we're going to do what. When stuff supposed to be submitted to us, when we're going to talk about things, when we're going to approve things that keep people on track. And again, transparency. Put your budget calendar, once you adopt it, put it as an attachment within your budget. And then every single year, you adjust the dates. I'll talk more about capital improvements plans later on, but now is the time to review those and start doing those. It's time to review your other plans. Hopefully you have a strategic plan. It's time to review that plan, and hopefully you accomplished some things last year. You can cross those things on. You got some new priorities. You can add those steps to dates. Look at your master plan. You know, again, every 5 years you have to review that. You don't have to update it, but you have to review that. Make sure you're doing that. And start gathering information. Contracts. You guys contract for police services? I don't know. Okay. So a lot of communities, for example, contract with the sheriff's department. You know, making sure what's the contract, what's the updated on that, any big expenditures you're going to have. One of the things I like to, at-large assessments can be kind of out of the blue because the drain commissioner can just do those anytime they want. Obviously within certain statutory requirements, but those can be a big hit. So talk to the drain commission, figure out if there's going to be at-large assessments that are going to be assessed to the township. Employee contracts, if you have any of those. Talk with the road commissioner early on about what some of the projects are, what your guys' priorities are. So this is, again, start gathering information. A lot of communities use a finance committee, so that gives you an opportunity, instead of just having one person do this, put together 2 or 3 people that can work through developing the budget from the beginning to the end and guide it through. So if you do that, it'll be a good time to set that committee up. Then we want to begin to compare, to compile our actual budget. And you can do this 2 different ways. One, you can do it within BSNA, which is what you guys do, which is awesome. A lot of the budgets I do in spreadsheets. The reason I do that, for 2 reasons. One, I've always done it that way, and sometimes change is easier to just keep doing what you're doing. But it also allows me more flexibility because I add a lot more notes and information, and that information can carry from year to year to year. And then especially with communities that have very complicated wages, for example, speeder, you can have other tabs that tie into that. You can't do some of that BSNA. But for you guys, BSNA is perfect, but you still have to reset it. You have to go to BSNA, you have to add years, you have to add information, so you have to start doing that process. And you have to make sure that you have the right elements. I talked about early on that at a minimum, we have to have, and you guys have this, so you're good, you have to have last year's actual, you have to have this year's projected at the end of the year, and then you have to have whatever you're requesting or recommended for the upcoming year. So those are the minimums, and you have to have the fund balances. So these numbers down here at the bottom, in which you guys have all that stuff, so you're in good position, but you just want to make sure from year to year that you continue to include all that stuff. Then, now we've got we started the process, now it's time to start engaging. Meeting with, the clerk and the treasurer and talking about what, the changes to the early voting this year is a perfect example. Talk about that stuff, what's going to impact, how's that, what do I have to increase to, are we doing this, are we contracting with the county, whatever you guys decide to do, that's going to have impacts. Talking with the fire department, etc. You may want to consider doing a work session, because this allows a more of an informal process to sit around and talk about what are our plans for the upcoming year? How are we doing this year? What are some things? Oh, we don't have a fund balance policy. Let's adopt that policy. How are we doing? Do we need to be very conservative on expenditures this year? Can we be a little bit more aggressive? All those types of things that you can do. One of the things, though, is that it's easy to get lost in the weeds. During the meeting, somebody's looking at the budget, and then they're like, supplies last year was $75, and this year it's $125. Why is there such a big difference in supplies from one year to the next? well, it's probably not gonna make or break the community. And it's easy sometimes is that people grasp onto what they can understand. And sometimes it's easier to understand the little things than it is to understand the bigger thing that's more complex. But your job as elected officials is to be looking at that big picture. It's to set policy and set guidance. And so while the little details are important, because we don't want to spend more money than we need to, just be careful to not get lost in the weeds when you go through that stuff. So work session becomes important. And then as we continue to develop it, now it's time to develop the numbers. This is the most difficult, challenging thing to do. But the first thing that I like to focus on is that projection column. So before I start thinking about the next year's budget and what I need for that one, I need to know how I ended up, or I'm going to end up this year. And that does two things for me. One is it's another year of data that I can look at. I have 3 or 4 years of data that I can look at where my utility bills, while they've been, $20,000 the last 3 years, this year I'm projecting it to be $35,000 because energy prices increased, or, we put our AC unit went bad, or whatever it is. But that's an example of the more time you spend on this existing year's budget and the projections for this year's expenditures, the better you can understand your budget. So instead of just saying, I'm just going to increase everything by 2%, what you're doing is looking at every single account item, looking at what you historically spent over the last few years, looking at what you spent at this point. So in this scenario, if I'm 9 months in the budget and I spent $35,000, well, that's an average of $3,800 a month, and times that times 12, that's how much I might spend at the end of the year. Well, that works great if that account has consistent expenditures, but if it's something like liability insurance where you pay once a year, it may not tell you anything. But by combining the historical information with this information and ultimately really digging in and understanding that line item, you're going to understand what the drivers are that affect those revenues and expenditures, which means that for the next year's budget, for the estimate for next year that you're going to recommend, it's going to be even better, right? So it's time consuming, but it allows you to ultimately get a budget where it's closer to what the actual revenues and expenditures are going to be. That's our goal. We want to have a budget that be at the end of the year, the beginning of the year versus the end of the year, that's pretty similar to what we started with. If we see lots of variation from year to year to year to year, then that means we're probably not getting as much depth as we do for those items, which I'll talk about later. Then I like to talk on the revenue side, we have to understand our taxable value because again, for taxes are one of our largest sources of revenue. We have to understand what the changes are happening, what the impacts of Proposal A is, what our millage rates are, what the impacts of Headley. So every single year, based upon Headley, if you have too much growth, then you have what's called a Headley rollback. And so it was a way to limit jurisdictions from generating basically too much revenue and taxing and the purpose of it back in 82 or 92, can't remember, was to not tax people out of their homes. And so if values increase, then that's part of the inflation. And if your millage rate stays the same, then people pay a lot more money in taxes. And so Headley was a way to slow that process down. Now, the problem we have is Headley and Proposal A work against each other now. We have two competing things. But in your guys' case, for your operating millage, you can under state law, you can levy up to 1 mil. You guys are only levying 0.382 mils because you have been rolled back during the period of time. Well, if you have a situation where you, as I mentioned before, when your taxable value for a long period of time was at 1% growth, well, one way you can get more revenue from my taxable value is not increasing, is change the other side of the formula, and you can do a Headley override. So you can go from 0.7 mils, and you can override that and say, I want to go back to 1 mil. You don't have to levy at 1 mil. You can say, I only need 0.9 mils. But you can do that. So those statistics, you have to understand the impacts of that. And then roads, you're limited to 0.97 mils. And then I was confused about fire. So you have 2 millages for fire. When was that passed?
Just last,
Well, we renewed it last year.
Last year, okay. Because when I looked at the
she amended the 4029.
Okay, and so it's not.
I have it in the office,
Yeah.
but I don't know why you don't see it, but.
Yeah, so it doesn't matter, but it probably should have been updated to county, and the county should have been updated to the
Well,
state.
the county was the one who updated it.
Yeah, but they should have submitted the
They
updated
never
version.
submitted it properly.
Yeah, yeah. No big deal, but that's, and then on the expenditure side, you know, looking at wage and benefits and the impact of those changes. Any one-time projects that you have coming up, we already talked about contracts that you might have. And you guys don't have utility systems, but this is time now to look at rates.
Before you go,
Yes, sir.
can you go back?
Yep.
You said that we could roll back to pre-Headley reduction of up to 1 mil.
Yep.
The county is going through a whole process of trying to do that same thing, but they're having to go to the citizens to get that
Yes.
changed. Is that something that?
Correct.
We did?
Yeah,
we
I'm
just
sorry.
can't roll it back.
I was not clear on that. Very good point. Thank you. So to change your taxation, you have to do two things. One, to do a Headley override, you have to go back to the voters. And you have to say, I want to do a Headley override. The second thing you have to do, which is kind of funny, is that when you go to pass your budget, there's another law, and we'll see it later on, called the Truth in Taxation Act, and it requires you to put a very specific notice in the paper. Because your Headley override says, okay, I want to override it, go back to a mill. So now I'm legally allowed to go up to a mill. And then when you adopt your budget, now you're going to say, well, what am I actually going to set as my millage rate? So I could keep it, I can do a Headley override, which is a great thing to do, because communities do this, they'll do a Headley override, but they won't change the millage rate. And you keep it at 7.382. Well, then you don't have to do truth in taxation. But if you move it from 7.383, then you have to put the special notice in the paper, because now you're increasing your millage rate, your taxes on people. So, or you can go all the way up to mill, it doesn't matter, but and again, all it is a notice, you just have to make sure you do that notice. And then when you adopt, going back to the budget appropriations resolution, then when you adopt your budget, and via the appropriations resolution, you guys have a section in there that says, for operating, this is my millage rate. For roads, this is my millage rate. For fire operating, for fire equipment, you know, and it sets all of those millage rates in there. So, good question. So we'll talk about CIP in the next one, but one of the things that with your capital improvements plan, it's technically a plan that the planning department does, and so prior to the board adopting the budget, we want the planning commission to review and adopt the capital improvements plan. We'll talk more about that later. I'd like to have a budget workshop as well, because now I've got the actual numbers we're going to do. So now it's an opportunity again to come in and review those with the other board members, review those with the public, talk about you know, the impacts of the budget that we have submitted. Especially if you have a fire department, it's an opportunity for the fire department to come in and talk to the board about what they requested, what you guys ultimately are deciding to approve, and have a conversation about that. Any other departments that you have. And then ultimately you have to hold a public hearing. So these are legal requirements to hold that public hearing. Now that public hearing can be any time. It just has to be before you formally adopt it. Doesn't matter when it is. It can be part of the budget workshop if you wanted to. I like to break them up separate, because this gives you an opportunity to talk about the numbers and then refine the numbers. And once you have them refined, then you bring them back to the board, and then you hold your public hearing. Now the public gets to see the final version. You still can make changes. Even after you hold a public hearing, the board can make any changes they want to have, but you just have to have those. And again, if you are increasing your millage rate from the previous year, there's a different notice that has to go in the paper. After you do that, now we have to adopt the budget. One question always comes up, well, when do I have to do it? Well, it has to be before the end of the fiscal year. Yeah, but what happens if we forgot and we do it 3 days after? State law says you can't. State law says that if you don't adopt the budget at the end of the fiscal year, you can't spend any money, not a penny, until you have an officially adopted budget. So one of the things I always make sure is, going back to the budget calendar, give you plenty of time, because you never know what's gonna happen. You might have some controversy. You might have something silly like a pandemic that would never happen in our lifetime. We don't know what's gonna happen. So, give yourself a month and a half to get through those, get those things adopted before the end of the fiscal year, get it done earlier. The only downside, the earlier you give it, the more difficult your projections are, right? Because if you do it 3 months before versus 3 days before, you have a completely different understanding of where you're gonna end up. But I'm one for early. And then we talked about the budget appropriations resolution and what has to be included in that. So after you adopt the budget, again, you're not done. Actually, there's other things that you should think about adopting at the same time. You should include your capital improvements plan and adopt that at the same time, which we'll talk about that. Any fee schedules that you have, so if you guys charge fees for copies or whatever, just put that as part of your budget and adopt that every year, because that way it makes sure that you review those. I have a lot of communities that they haven't updated their fees in 25 years. They don't even know what the fees are. So just make it part of the formal process that every year you review your fees and then you update them. You guys don't have a lot, but you can do that. If you have any employees, it's a good time to set their wages, and then it's also a good time to formally update the strategic plan as well. So after you adopt the budget, you're not done. Now we have to start monitoring it. So one of the things that governments are required to do is produce a revenue and expenditure report, and the board should review that. And on your expenditure revenue report, you'll see more on the next page as well. But normally what I include is what the current year amended budget is, how much money we've used so far to date, any encumbrances, which you guys don't use, so we wouldn't worry about that, and then how much money that you have available. And you can have a couple more columns on here. But this gives you an idea, a way to measure that, because again, you have a fiduciary responsibility. You don't have a fiduciary responsibility just to adopt the budget, but you have a fiduciary responsibility to monitor that budget and make sure that you're evaluating those financial conditions. One of the things that's important to think about is that the more actively you manage that, the more quickly you'll identify problems or challenges, which gives you more time to fix and solve a problem. You're not monitoring your budget, and you wait until the 9 months, and you all of a sudden realize, go back to my utility bills, for example, all of a sudden we've had some major problem with utility bills, it's 300% what it was last year. We didn't know that. Well, you can't fix it. You know, maybe there's a problem with your HVAC system that just needs to be fixed. Maybe we had escalating rates, and so now we have to reduce something else. And the earlier you can do that, the less dramatic changes you have to be. When I go back to 2007 and the economic crisis, because I immediately jumped on that we needed to change what we were doing, I was able to manage that more effectively than I have other communities, friends of mine, that they just didn't know what to do, they didn't think about it, they waited a year and a half, 2 years to start thinking about it. Their decisions were way more drastic than what my decisions would be because they weren't as proactive on that. So that's why we want to make sure we actively review and monitor that budget. Now this is the same report, same patterns on another page, but here's our different columns that we have. So this is what our amended budget was, this is how much money we spent today, and this is how much money we have. And when you get this report, we also have this percentage used column over here. And it's pretty easy to review. You look at the report, the first thing that I do is I look at by the individual department, and I say, what percentage are they used to this point? So in this budget, in this community, we were at 8 months in, so 66%. So assuming my expenditures were the same every single month, and they're always not, but anything that's greater than 66% is a little bit of a red flag for me. Maybe, right? Maybe not. So in this case, I'm way under 66% here. I'm doing really well for the elections office, but I also have to think, well, I haven't had an election yet, right? So that might change this dramatically. But if I already had both my elections, I know I'm setting pretty well. And then this one, I'm a little bit closer to it, I'm 53%, a little bit more concerning. But after I look at the total department, then I look at any outliers in the individual line items here. So in this case, dues and membership, it's 80%. Well, dues and memberships, I know I pay MTA, I know that I pay my 3rd month of the year, and that's all I pay. I'm not worried about that one, right? But how things are looking. The other thing that I want to look out for, which we'll talk more about when we get to the disbursement side, is making sure things are being charged in the right area. You know, contractual services, you know, hey, we spent $6,000 here, but we haven't let that contract yet. Why is that $6,000? Oh, yeah, that was a contracted services. That should have been, who knows, someplace else. So that's part of your monitoring as well, is to make sure that you're putting the money where it's supposed to be put at. So as part of that month review, like I said, review those revenues and expenditures, review those capital projects. So this year you have in the governing body, you have money in capital outlay. Well, it's not good enough just to measure the numbers, but you got to measure whatever the project is as well. When's it supposed to be let? Are the prices coming back higher than they expected? Is the contractor on schedule? Are we going to have overruns? All of those are the responsibility of the board. Operations changes. All of a sudden, if I have you know, a deputy, and all of a sudden that person decides to move to another state, well, that's a staffing change. What kind of impact is that going to have on me? New laws, economic trends, all those are the types of things that you have to be thinking about monitoring, not just the numbers. One thing that I am a big supporter of is tying back, having a strategic plan, number one, but tying back every single board's decision. So if I have a strategic plan and I say this is what my priorities are, then my expenditures throughout the year should match my strategic plan. And if it doesn't, then why is that? Well, things change, that's okay. Maybe we need to adjust our plan. But maybe it's something that we shouldn't have a priority for. Maybe it's something we shouldn't be spending the money on. So what I like to do is that every single board action that I have, I make it tied directly back to the strategic plan. So when you're voting on something, you guys already talked about this is a priority a year and a half ago. This is something we want to work on. We want to invest in our playground equipment at our park, blah, blah, blah. And now I have the expenditure coming up. You've already, in a sense, debated that, talked about that. It makes the decision-making and the approval process a lot easier. So I like to tie, I only not have a motion, but then I have where does that fit in with my strategic plan. So it specifically ties out, this is really into public safety, and under public safety, we wanted to do X, Y, Z. That lays that out. Again, I already talked about this. Again, it's a lot easier to be proactive for budgetary change than it is to be reactive to address shortfalls and surpluses that you might have on an ongoing basis. Now, as you monitor your budget, first of all, your budget's a plan. All plans need to be changed and adjusted. Some of these plans, if I start my budget 6 months before, I'm 18 months before the end of the fiscal year. I'm not going to be perfect on that. You're going to have cost overruns. You're going to have new statutory requirements that you're going to have. And so you might have to do budget adjustments. So when do you do budget adjustments? Well, you do budget adjustments anytime that you know that you should do a budget adjustment. You don't wait until the end of the year. But if I'm approving that playground equipment, and I know I budgeted 50, and it's coming in at $53,000, do a budget adjustment right then and right there. You approve the expenditure for the playground equipment, and the next action you take is do a budget adjustment. You also do budget adjustments based upon that monitoring. You have the project, the revenue and expenditures report that you have, and if any of those that look like they're going to be overrun by the end of the year, you do a budget adjustment then. Well, how do you do them? Well, these are two different examples from two different communities. It doesn't matter how you do a budget adjustment, it just matters that the board does one and officially changes the budget. So the first one, I like both of these for different reasons. The first one I like is because it's a lot easier for the layperson to read. I know what my previous budget is, I'm increasing it by 50%, and my new number is $15,000. It's clear and concise what the change is. Most communities, the only thing that you see is this. Well, $5,000 for what? $5,000 for a $10,000 budget is a lot different than $5,000 for a $150,000 budget, right? So this provides more transparency for the board. And the public reading it, right? If the public reads your minutes, they should be able to understand that. This one I like for a different reason, which is when you do a budget adjustment, the money comes from someplace. It just, you just don't go out to the money tree in the backyard. You actually have to take it from someplace. So this example, it's a budget adjustment for the roads capital outlay, and in this community, they have a transportation reserve, and so we know that's where the money's coming from, so money we've set aside. This one, and most of the time, 95% of the time, it looks like this, so this is very similar to this one, but our numbers don't match up, I should have made the numbers match, but, it's coming out of the general fund balance, because most of the time, when you do the budget adjustment, you have a reserve, that's what your reserve's for, and that's where the money comes from. Right? So that's those two different approaches. I haven't figured out, or maybe I haven't spent enough time to figure out how to combine the two of those, but I'm sure there's a way that you can combine those. The other thing that I do one of the most common findings that local governments have is at the end of the year, they're over in 3 or 4 or 5 line items, and then they get a finding in their audit. Well, how do you prevent that? Well, what I do is I have every community I work with, the last week of their fiscal year, set a special meeting. And if you need the special meeting, you can come in, you can do any last minute budget adjustments. If you don't need it, you cancel the special meeting. And then that's just one more way, because you might do your budget adjustments, 30 days before the end of the fiscal year, but you forgot that playground equipment, you haven't got the bill yet, but the bill is going to come in 30 days after the fiscal year. And now this goes back way at the beginning when we talked about how you recognize revenue. Well, in the general fund, because the expenditure was in this current fiscal year, even though I got the bill the next fiscal year, I have to accrue it back. And now all of a sudden, that account, which we budgeted 50, cost $55,000, now $5,000 budget. If that's the only thing in that department that I have, now I'm over budget. So it gives you an opportunity to do one more look at any of those items that not only that are currently over, right? That's the first thing, any items that are currently over budget, but also anything you have to accrue back. The most common thing you have to accrue back is wages, because we always have our pay period is different than our fiscal year end. So if you get paid every 2 weeks, then you're gonna maybe have 1 week that's on the last fiscal year, the next week that's on the next fiscal year. You pay both of those in the next fiscal year, you have to accrue back half of that to the previous fiscal year. So that's the one comment. Yes, sir.
While most budget increases come from some fund balance, can you also have a budget increase in one department? And
Yes.
say, okay, we're gonna pass on this other one, we're gonna take the adjustment to, we're just not gonna do this thing.
Yes.
this coming year.
Yeah, absolutely. So let me go to the playground equipment. So we decided we can't get the equipment this year, not gonna come in. Oh, we're gonna shift that and do something else. We have a new priority, or maybe it's not even shifting, but this project over here is gonna be over. So you can have the same transaction, because it has to come from someplace. So this is a horrible example, but because I can't move between funds. But I could take it from the Parks and Recs department as an example, whatever the department is, and I can take it from that expenditure account. Now the other thing is, this is a good point, is that, so when does the board have to do budget adjustments? Well, the board has to do budget adjustments depending upon what authority they've given somebody else to do budget adjustments. So what do I mean by that? I don't remember what your guys' budget appropriation says, but most budget appropriations, when you pass your budget, say in it that whoever your financial manager is, most of the time it's either supervisor or the clerk, they might be able, as an example, move money within any department. So I don't want to use it, let's say this is the treasurer's office, in the budget appropriations resolutions, you've given somebody to say, okay, and I know that the treasurer's supply is going to be over budget by $10,000. I'll allow you to move money within the treasurer's department. You can't, most communities don't allow you to move money between departments, but within the treasurer's department, if you want to move it from supplies, from capital outlay to supplies, then they can do that administratively. They don't have to go to the board for that. If your budget appropriations resolution doesn't say who has to do budget adjustments or when budget adjustments can be done, then everything has to be taken to the board. But my guess is you guys, because you use a kind of standard format that other communities use, it probably says something in there that gives you some ability to do administrative budget adjustments. Does that make sense?
Like like our fire chief has a surplus, or, not a surplus, a miscellaneous account in his budget, and he decides that, a couple radios broke.
Yeah.
I've already spent my radio budget, and I need to spend a little more.
Yes.
He doesn't have to come to the board, he has a budget.
If that's what the appropriation says. So sometimes, I've seen it all different ways. I've seen it where, especially in big, like I did a presentation for a county, they allowed the department head, and I'm gonna make up my numbers here, to move up to $5,000, as the counties was bigger. And so they could, if your miscellaneous fire chief, he or she could move that up to $5,000. And then between 5,000 and 15,000, whoever the chief financial officer is, maybe it's the supervisor, maybe it's the clerk, can move up to $15,000. And anything over $15,000, you have to take back to the board. Some communities allow just one person to do that, whoever your chief financial officer is. So it depends on what you, all of those are perfectly fine, it's just whatever you guys agree to in terms of how you want to allow management of that budget.
And that needs to be put in writing and part of the,
Yeah.
what's voted on.
Yeah, so there's two different ways you can do it. I like to do it as appropriation resolution. I don't know why I like to do it that way, but like the community I was talking about, the county, they had a policy. And that policy, their policy was way more complex because they didn't allow you to move wages as an example. So the only thing you could move were any of your operating expenditures. You couldn't touch wages, So you can do it different way, but they had a policy because their policy was more complex. But most communities, again, just do it in the budget appropriations resolution, which I'm pretty sure that you guys have something in there now that allow you to do that. It still makes sense. So, what's that?
Because I don't remember what it says.
Yeah. I didn't look for it. Okay, so part of the monitoring, I already alluded to this a little bit, but you gotta approve disbursements. So when you put the budget together, a lot of people say, well, it's in the budget, you've already approved me to spend the money on it. No, your budget's a plan, and that plan still has to follow your purchasing policy, right? You just can't go out and buy something just because it's in the budget. I'll pick on the fire chief as an example, you got the new radios in there. Well, I budgeted for 5 radios, I just get to go buy them. No, you probably have a purchasing policy, that purchasing policy probably says how you have to go out and buy that type of stuff. And then they have to follow your purchasing policy, you still have to take it back to the board, and the board has to approve it, because there may be things that the fire chief doesn't know in this situation. Like, oh, XYZ happened, we can't buy the radios this year, we have to delay that, whatever management decision that you guys have to make, but ultimately you have to approve those. Now, there are some things, and this is in your guys' budget appropriations as well, that allow you to say, well, us waiting is gonna be a detriment for us. So the most common one is anything that you get penalties or fees on, that if you don't pay the bills, utility bills. Most utility bills will say, you don't pay in 30 days, you gotta pay 5%. Well, utility bills are something you pay every single month, pretty much the same amount of money within some type of reason. So in your resolution, the appropriations resolution, you define what bills or what items can be paid for without first having the board approve it. So you just want to look at that and make sure it meets what your guys' needs are. But everything else has to come back to the board. Now, for those items that did get paid, utility bills, you still have to bring it back to the board after the fact, because you still have to be transparent. The board still has to approve it, but technically it's already been paid, because you guys' job is to monitor that. Because again, while the utility bill got paid, if all of a sudden it's a lot more money for some particular reason, I need to know about that. But you're not only looking at improving those expenditures to make sure they're in line in the budget, you need to look at those expenditures as a critical eye as well. So this is an opportunity to ensure that your internal controls are strong and appropriate. So making sure that you're not only looking at that this is being paid, but are you paying this out of the right account? So I have the utility bill as an example, and now all of a sudden it's coming out of capital outlay. Why is that? That's the wrong account number. You can't have good financial management if you don't have good numbers to rely on. So if you don't know what my utility bills are from year to year to year, how can you project what they'll be for next year if you're inconsistent in charging utility bills to that same line item? Now that's why it's really critical. So make sure that you're charging things to the right accounts. Also make sure when you're looking at your expenditures, look at is this a new vendor? I've never, is a vendor with a funny name? Is there a good description of what this money is being spent for, right? You have to look at this because fraud does happen. I worked in several communities that had those problems, and so one way you can do that is having a critical eye and asking questions. The community that I worked in, the last one, about every month, his name was Brian Ross, he would look through the expenditures and he'd pull out 2 or 3 items on here, and he'd say, what is this? Who's this vendor? Have we done business with them before? What is expenditures before? And it was a great way to, it makes sure, it changes the perspective if everybody knows that somebody's looking at something versus people don't know people are looking at things. So look at some of those types of things and have a critical eye. Payroll's challenging because it's probably one of the items that most consistently has a problem because it's so complex, especially related to taxation, IRS. So just make sure that the community, you're paying whatever your taxes and distributions that you're supposed to be paying. So I have another community I work with, this has been a problem for over a year and a half. They got a notice from the IRS, they weren't paying the right amount of money, and they didn't do anything about it, so the penalty goes even higher. Be proactive with that. It's a challenge, but just make sure that that stuff's being paid because, again, now you're paying penalties and it's other people's money. The other thing you want to have is you should have an investment report. So you guys have investments. That report should be provided from the treasurer to the township board, and you should review that report because investments have more risk associated with them. So you need to know where you're having your money at. The other thing, and you guys do a pretty good job of that, but I work in a number of communities that they don't have investments. They have every money in cash. Well, now it's not as big a deal because our savings accounts are getting a lot more interest. But back in the day, you were getting 0.6% interest. I mean, you were losing money if you kept it in the bank. And the only way that you can make money is if you put it into investments. And so a cash analysis is an idea that says, okay, this is how much money I have. This is how much money I'm going to need throughout the year. So I look at what my expenditures are going to be. I can look at how much money I have to have in the bank to spend bills. And everything else, I can put in investments. I put in investments, I have more risk, which says you have to be aware of that, but I can also earn a lot more money. So an example of that, do you guys use Michigan Class? Okay. Michigan Class is a perfect example of that. Yes, we use Michigan Class. We knew that. I knew that answer. So a good example of you get a lot higher returns than what you've had to, and you don't have to know as much about investing. So it's an easier option to look at. If you have grants are a pain in the butt. There's no such thing as free money because there's all kinds of other requirements that come along with those. But make sure you have a good system and process in place to track those. And make sure you're board, you make sure that you're in compliance with those. Because what you don't want is get the free money and then get out of grant compliance and then have to give the money back after you spend it all. So, and then monitor your general ledger. We talked a little bit about this, but make sure you're spending the money on all the right accounts. And then make sure that there are 2 things. One is make sure that you're recording your revenues and expenditures timely. Because if you get the budget and expenditure report, but you haven't put in the payroll entries of what you paid, or the parks bill, the playground equipment that you paid, then how do you know where you're at? So make sure that not only are you looking at their expenditures in here, but are you keeping up and you're entering them timely. And then on the same regard, bank recs have to be done every single month. Make sure the bank recs are being done 30 days after the end of the year. So in summary, your budget, developing your budget is one of the most critical tasks that you do. Your budget implements your vision, your strategy, your priorities, and communicates those to your employees and your citizens. You have a fiduciary responsibility to use your constituent resources effectively and efficiently. And the takeaways, your budget is more than just numbers. Start with long-term plans and objectives, and your budget is about the long term, not the short term. Involve your stakeholders early in the process. Use data and analysis and putting together the projections, i.e. don't just increase it by 2% a year. And be transparent and communicate your budget decisions to your community. All right, so capital improvements plan. I talked about this a dozen times, I haven't defined that. So what's a capital improvements plan? Well, the Planning and Enabling Act requires local governments to have a capital improvements plan. There's an exception. I'm going to skip that for a second. So what is a capital improvements plan? Well, you have a master plan that says this is what our community we want it to become 30 years in the future. Well, you need to have a plan of what capital you need to spend to get there, right? So if your capital improvements plan talks about parks and recreation, then you should have a plan of how you get there. Your capital improvements plan talks about your road and your road network and your infrastructure. Your capital improvements plan then should have a plan in terms of what we need to do to maintain and upgrade our road system. So that's why it's why the Planning Commission actually is the one that's supposed to develop it and is supposed to adopt it. Now in reality, most communities, Planning Commission is not going to know those details. So what happens is the community, the board, their delegates create the plan, and then they have the Planning Commission review and adopt that. So what is included in your capital improvements plan? Well, a capital improvements plan at a minimum covers 6 years. So any assets that you have, so township buildings, et cetera, any assets you have, fire truck, et cetera, are what you need to replace within the next 6 years at the minimum, and how much is it going to cost to replace that item in the future. Now, the one thing that you have to keep in mind is that your capital improvements plan is a plan, and most of the time, there's way more things that you need to spend your money on. Capital is your most expensive thing you spend your money on, and so there's probably a lot of things that will be on that plan that you aren't going to be able to actually budget for. But you put utopia, if you will, on that. The plan helps you then make decisions because it helps you prioritize how you're spending those resources. It allows you to think about, I talked about debt before, so it gives you an opportunity to think long beforehand those expenditures. How are we going to fund this? Are we going to fund this out of cash flows? Are we going to save money for it? Are we going to bond for it in the future? It allows you to begin to be thinking into that future. It also allows you, I've got a number of situations where I put stuff on a list that was on the capital improvements plan that was a want. It wasn't a need, but it was a want. And then all of a sudden a grant came out, and because we had an official planning document, then I was able to apply for it and get the grant dollars to do something I would have never spent money on because I would have never taken it out of operating to do that. Capital improvements plan also is a great transparency. So when we talked about your fund balance, we talked about having too much. So if I'm a community and I'm at the 90th percentile of my fund balance, and you citizens are just listening to this and saying, well, wait a sec, he said too much was bad, their fund balance is 90%. Oh my God, they're keeping all our money. But if you don't have the full picture, which is, yeah, but we've got to buy a fire truck that now costs $1.2 million. We've got to replace the playground equipment. We got a sewer system where we got to replace that. We got to put a new roof on the township hall. We got to do all these types of things. All of a sudden, that 80% or whatever you have, quickly you can see gets evaporated away. And then after you spend the money on that stuff, you now might be down to 40%, changes that perspective, right? So the capital improvements plan allows you to kind of explain that large money that you might be holding in reserves. Because then it goes back to, on the too much side, if you don't know that you need the money, then it's easier to say you have too much. But if you know that you need the money because your expenditure is coming, then keeping a larger fund balance is perfectly fine. Now, I said there's an exception. Everybody has to do a capital improvements plan. The exception to that is townships that don't have water and sewer systems. So technically, you guys don't have to have a capital improvements plan. You don't have to do it. But it's an absolute best practice. Everybody has assets. There's no better way to plan for those assets. So what has to be included? This is just an example from a couple different communities. Here's a simple list of, here's my projects in the future, here's what the description is, here's the dollar amount. Those are the minimums. But I'm always an advocate of doing more than the minimum. And so one of the things you can do, just like I said before, go to other communities and steal from them what they've included in their capital improvements plan and how they did it. So one of the things that I like to see is a ranking system as an example. So it helps you prioritize that. If I have two assets I need to replace, how do I decide? It's $50,000 for both of them. How do I decide one versus the other? We have a ranking system that says, well, I'm going to look at the age of the asset. If one asset lasts 10 years and the other lasts 75 years, what's a better investment? Okay? 75-year investment is. If one investment is for public safety, but one investment is for recreation, quality of life, well, quality of life is important, but public safety is probably more important if that's what your priorities are. So a ranking system helps you define some of those types of things. The other thing I like to include is things other than traditional capital. So technically, capital improvements plan is about assets, depreciating assets. But I like to include things like your master plan. A master plan update can cost you $50,000, $75,000. That's a large expenditure. Why not put it in your capital improvements plan? Because now we can think about, oh yeah, that's coming out here 5 years from now. Maybe I need to be thinking about that. Maybe I don't do these other things, like buy the parks equipment, when I know that I have to do my master plan and that's required by law. And so I put things on there like cars. Cars a lot of times can be just operating expenses, and they don't include it on there. So I put any non-normal large expenditure on the capital improvements plan, just as a transparency item in a planning perspective. So kids, go to other local governments, deal for them. All right, keep going or break?